Visiting the railroad grade was more than just a field trip for me. It was really walking in the historical steps of my own family. To be able to see what the sounds were, to see what the sights were, to hear the silence that was out there, to feel the dry air, to walk in the same path that my grandfather, my great-great-grandfather may have walked and probably did walk. To see how hard the ground was, how harsh the environment was, to see how desolate it was such an emotional connection. Even now, thinking about it, I'm getting emotional because it's tangible, it's real, it's not just stories passed down.
The Chinese that came to the United States in the 19th century came as any other immigrant population, looking for a new chance, a new opportunity, and a way to support their family. In China, during the same period, there was a series of violent civil wars, civil unrest, drought, famine, and really the breaking of almost a 3,000-year pattern of existence for these usually farmers. When the United States struck gold in 1849, many of these Chinese immigrants saw us as Gumsan, or Gold Mountain. As early as 1863, the Central Pacific Railroad began experimenting with Chinese labor. In Sacramento, where the Central Pacific began construction, it was very hard for the railroad to maintain a labor force because of how close the gold fields were to Sacramento. So working closely with Chinese companies in San Francisco and Sacramento, they were able to procure about 13,000 Chinese laborers at the peak of construction of the Central Pacific Railroad in 1865 and 66. Many of the accomplishments of the Chinese workers included the massive tunnels cutting through the Sierra Nevadas, the 10 miles in 1 day feed in Utah, and overall the complete domination of maintenance crews for the next 30 years by Chinese labor.
Having an ancestor who is a railroad worker means a great deal to me today. Now, I didn't always know that I had a railroad ancestor, and that's because so much of the history of our Chinese railroad workers have been lost. Many of the names were never recorded. A lot of the census in the U.S. didn't record Chinese workers. And so some of the stories that I have are only the ones that have survived, going from generation to generation and then coming to me.
Terrace, located about 30 miles inside the Utah border, was founded in 1869 during construction of the original Central Pacific Railroad. In 1870, it was the third largest Chinatown in the entire Utah territory. Terrace boasted a population of about 60 in the census records, but historically we know that census takers generally undercounted the number of Chinese residents in any community. Terrace contained a fairly large, robust Chinese community. There's much material culture, artifacts here that speak to their heritage and their cultural identity. But it also speaks to the racism of the period, where the Chinese part of town is actually segregated from the white and commercial districts and located behind the industrial works and coal bins in Terrace. So this little artifact is a hand-formed spout. So this spout would have been attached to what we call a spouted jar. This would have been imported from China, brought all the way here to Terrace, and it would have held soy sauce or vegetable oil, which they would have used in their traditional cooking. In addition to spouted jars that held soy sauce or vegetable oil, the Chinese also imported liquor in stoneware jars like the one I'm holding. These stoneware jars would have been in the shape of a vase, and they would have held rice wine, plum wine, or a sorghum-based whiskey. And in the base of this one, you can actually still see the swirl of the potter who left their thumbprint in this over 200 years ago, and many of these vessels were still handmade well into the 20th century. The most common style of porcelain ceramic that the Chinese railroad worker would have owned is this. This is what we call a bamboo-style rice bowl. It's called bamboo because if we would have had a whole piece, you would have seen vertical hand-painted blue lines depicting bamboo shoots. Now, the Chinese railroad workers didn't have a lot of disposable income, so they would have used this for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was durable and cheap. The second most common style of vessel we find on Chinese railroad worker sites is this. This is what we call a four seasons or four flowers pattern vessel. Now, this could have come in a bowl, a platter, a cup, or even a spoon. The pattern name actually refers to that hand-painted, over-glazed design, and it would have depicted the four seasons, spring, summer, fall, and winter, and each depicted by a different flower. This is slightly more expensive than the bamboo-style vessel. The third most common type of vessel we'll find on a Chinese railroad worker site is this. We call this a Celadon Style. Celadon refers to the bright bluish-green glaze. In the 19th century, Chinese potters were able to actually mimic earlier imperial-style Celadon glaze and then mass-produce it for workers around the world. So this is one of the most expensive types of wares available to the Chinese railroad workers and could have come in a bowl, cup, platter, or even a spoon. This small, unassuming piece of earthenware actually represents the smoking of opium by Chinese railroad workers. This earthenware pipe bowl would have sat on top of a bamboo or wood pipe. So opium actually came in sort of a thick molassesy texture, and you would have taken a small ball of it, put it on top of this pipe, and then put it into an open flame to aerosol the gas. And you can see on the top, this has actually been heavily discolored by being exposed to heavy fire from smoking event. So the Chinese railroad workers would have smoked opium for both medicinal and recreational purposes, given the amount of heavy toll railroad construction would have taken on their bodies. Perhaps the single largest problem that we have out here on the Central Pacific Railroad grade in western Box Elder County is looting and vandalism. BLM has spent the last 5 years finding ways to build interpretive signage, only to have most of them shot by recreationalists within even 1 day of them being installed. Looting during the 1960s through the present has removed important pieces of the story of the Chinese workers and all workers that had made this part of western Utah home. Looting takes pages out of a favorite book, mixes the pages together, and then allows us to tell no good story anymore.
Without the artifacts, there's no evidence of how they lived or where they lived or why they behaved in the way that they did. And so when looting happens or when vandalism happens, whether it's born out of ignorance or not, it destroys and erases my own history, my own past. And so it is much more than just stories. It is a personal affront to my family. But I don't take it as malice, and I take it as ignorance. And the more that we can get the stories out of what our ancestors went through and what the artifacts mean.
Preservation of our archaeological and historical resources is part of a communal need of all Utahns and all visitors to our state, that we all need to see ourselves in that history and work collaboratively together to all preserve it so the next generation can come out here or any places that there's archaeological history and find ways to find themselves in our past. But if we take it, that chance is lost.